The single chess piece felt impossibly heavy in his palm. It was a pawn, carved from a forgotten piece of birch, its head misshapen and leaning slightly to the left, its base uneven so that it perpetually rocked on any flat surface. The wood was worn smooth, stained dark by the oils of hands that had held it half a lifetime ago. Alistair Vance, a man whose net worth fluctuated with the whims of global markets but never dipped below a figure that could purchase a small nation, sat in the dark of his penthouse office, 47 floors above a city that glittered like a spilled tray of diamonds. He ignored the spectacle. His world was contained in the weight of this shabby wooden soldier. His thumb traced the crude knife marks that defined its collar. A voice, thin and reedy, crackled from the intercom on his sprawling obsidian desk. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Hayes is here with the final press schedule for the challenge." Alistair didn't move. The city lights cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, catching on the edges of priceless sculptures and the spines of leather-bound first editions he had never read. He pressed the pawn into his palm, the wood a familiar ache against his skin. "Did you ever lose something you could never replace, Jonathan?" he murmured, his voice a low rasp, not meant for the intercom. The silence that followed was thick with the assistant's confusion. Alistair slowly clenched his fist, the pawn digging into his flesh. "Send him in," he commanded, his voice returning to its usual ironclad tone. He slipped the pawn into his waistcoat pocket just as the door hissed open, burying the only piece of his past that mattered beneath layers of bespoke tailoring and impenetrable resolve. Jonathan Hayes was a man perpetually braced for impact. He moved with a quiet efficiency that Alistair demanded, his face a carefully composed mask of professional neutrality. He held a tablet that glowed with the evening's agenda, a meticulously planned circus of which Alistair was the unflappable ringmaster. "Sir, the limo is scheduled for 6 o'clock. The preliminary matches will be concluding as you arrive. We've arranged for a brief statement on the steps of the Grand Library. Then you'll be escorted to the exhibition hall. The mayor is confirmed. Senator Randolph sends his regrets, but his chief of staff will be attending. The network feed goes live at 7:30, sharp." Alistair rose from his chair, a towering figure silhouetted against the urban galaxy. He adjusted his cufflinks, the metallic click echoing in the cavernous office. "And the challenger list?" he asked, his tone clipped, dismissive. He already knew the answer: a parade of local grandmasters, ambitious university champions, and has-beens, looking for one last taste of the spotlight. None of them mattered. They were props. "As expected, sir. No one of consequence. A few international masters who were in the city for the Open. Mostly fodder for the early rounds. The final opponent will be decided by 7:15. It will likely be Dr. Eris Thorne. He's the highest-rated player in the state." Alistair nodded, a gesture so slight it was barely perceptible. "Thorne, the academic who wrote that tedious book on the Sicilian defense. He plays by the book. He'll be easy to dismantle." Jonathan hesitated. "There is one oddity. A late registration. The organizers wanted to dismiss it, but the press picked it up. A human interest angle." Alistair turned, his gaze finally meeting Jonathan's. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and vast. "Don't waste my time with human interest, Jonathan. This is about power, strategy, the complete and utter annihilation of an opponent. It is a lesson in dominance, broadcast to the world, sponsored by Vance Industries. Nothing more. Of course, sir. It's just the registrant is a child from the St. Jude's orphanage. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Alistair's eyes, a ghost of a shadow, there and gone in an instant. He felt the faint pressure of the wooden pawn against his ribs. A child? He repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The name is Lily. No last name provided. They say she's 10. Alistair let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. Then I hope for her sake she has a high tolerance for public humiliation. Make sure the cameras get a good shot of her when she cries. It will make for excellent television. He strode past his assistant without another glance. The master of a universe he had built to keep the rest of the world, and the memories it contained, at a permanent, unbridgeable distance. The Grand Library was a bastion of Beaux-Arts architecture, its marble steps and towering columns a declaration of permanence and knowledge. Tonight, it was besieged by a horde of satellite trucks and reporters, their cameras aimed like rifles at the entrance. Alistair Vance emerged from his limousine into a maelstrom of flashing lights and shouted questions. He moved through it all with the serene indifference of a shark gliding through a school of minnows. He paused at the designated podium, his face a mask of cool confidence. "Good evening," he began, his voice amplified, booming across the plaza. "For centuries, chess has been called the game of kings, a battle of intellect, foresight, and will. But in our modern age, it has become something more, a metaphor for the marketplace, for strategy, for success." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Tonight, I am here not merely to play a game. I am here to make a point, that in any field, in any battle, there is a winner and a loser. There is the person who sees 10 moves ahead, and the person who sees only one. My company, Vance Industries, is built on that principle. Tonight, I will demonstrate it." A reporter from the city's largest paper shouted a question. "Mr. Vance, what do you say to critics who call this a publicity stunt, a display of arrogance from a man who already has everything?" Alistair smiled, a thin predatory curve of his lips. "I would say they are correct. It is a display of what is possible when you refuse to accept mediocrity. And as for arrogance, it's only arrogant if you can't back it up." He turned and ascended the steps, leaving the clamoring press in his wake, the applause from the gathered elites inside the hall already reaching out to greet him. Inside, the exhibition hall was a cathedral of silence and tension. Row upon row of spectators sat in hushed reverence. The air was thick with the scent of old paper from the library's archives and the faint electric tang of broadcast equipment. On a raised stage, under a brilliant pool of light, sat a single chess table, its polished mahogany surface reflecting the expectant faces in the front row. Alistair took his seat, his posture immaculate, his presence commanding the entire room. He surveyed the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the politicians, the socialites, the business rivals who had come to watch him perform. They were all part of the set dressing. His opponent was brought to the stage, a flustered, balding man in a rumpled suit, Dr. Eris Thorne. He looked less like a grandmaster and more like a man who had just been informed his mortgage application was denied. He nervously adjusted his glasses and offered a trembling hand to Alistair. Alistair ignored it, his gaze fixed on the board. "The clock," he said, his voice a quiet command to the arbiter. The game began. Thorne, as predicted, opened with a classic Sicilian defense. Alistair countered with a rare aggressive variation, pushing his queen's pawn forward in a direct challenge. The commentators, broadcasting from a glass booth, murmured in surprise. Alistair was deviating from known theory, forcing his opponent into uncharted territory from the second move. The battle was a bloodbath. Alistair played with a brutal, relentless precision. He sacrificed a knight for a positional advantage that Thorne didn't see coming until it was too late. He created a pincer movement with his rooks, slowly squeezing the life out of Thorne's defenses. The academic's face grew pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Every move he made was a reaction, a desperate attempt to plug a new hole in his sinking ship. Alistair, by contrast, looked as if he were merely solving a simple crossword puzzle. His expression never changed. His breathing was even, his hands steady. He was a machine of pure logic and calculated aggression. The end came swiftly. Check. Thorne squirmed. Check. Thorne's king was forced into a corner. And then, the final, elegant move. Alistair slid his queen across the board, a silent executioner. Checkmate. The entire game had lasted 22 minutes. A wave of polite, astonished applause filled the hall. Thorne looked utterly broken. He stared at the board, then at Alistair, and mumbled his concession before practically fleeing the stage. Alistair simply stood up, gave a curt nod to the audience, and walked away from the table as if it were a triviality he had already forgotten. He had several more of these exhibitions to perform before the final main event. They were all the same. A new opponent, the same result. A doctor, a lawyer, a young programming prodigy. He dispatched them all with the same cold, surgical efficiency. He wasn't just winning, he was making a statement. He was untouchable. Meanwhile, in a cramped, drafty corner, near the back of the hall, a small group of children huddled together, chaperoned by a woman whose face was etched with a permanent, weary kindness. Mrs. Gable, the director of St. Jude's Orphanage, tried to keep her charges quiet, their threadbare coats pulled tight around their shoulders. They had been allowed in through a side entrance, a small act of pity from one of the event organizers who had read the short news blurb about the orphan chess player. Most of the children were mesmerized by the grandeur of the library, their eyes wide as they stared at the frescoed ceilings and gold leaf trim. But one of them, a small, quiet girl with large, solemn brown eyes and hair the color of dandelion fluff, saw none of it. Her gaze was locked on the stage, on the chessboard. Her name was Lily. She watched Alistair Vance's every move, her small brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't see the billionaire, the corporate titan. She saw the pieces. She saw the patterns, the dance of bishops, and the charge of knights. When Alistair sacrificed his knight against Dr. Thorne, a collective gasp went through the audience. But Lily merely nodded to herself, as if she had been expecting it. One of the older boys from the orphanage, a lanky teenager named Sam, nudged her. "He just gave away his horse for nothing," he whispered. Lily shook her head, her eyes never leaving the board. "He didn't give it away," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "He traded it. He bought the long, open road for his queen." Mrs. Gable put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you enjoying the show, dear?" Lily nodded, but her expression was not one of enjoyment. It was one of intense, analytical focus, a look far too old for her 10 years. She was not watching a show, she was studying. The journalist's name was Sarah Jenkins. She worked for a small, independent online publication that valued deep dives over clickbait headlines. She had been assigned the Alistair Vance story, and she found the man both repulsive and fascinating. She had watched the press conference, noting the practiced, empty charisma. She had watched the first few games, recognizing the skill, but sensing the profound emptiness behind the spectacle. It was all too perfect, too polished. Men like Alistair Vance, in her experience, didn't get that way without burying a lot of bodies, literally or metaphorically. The human interest angle about the Orphan challenger was her only real lead into a different kind of story. She had dismissed it at first, as Vance himself had. But as she watched the billionaire dismantle his opponents with such joyless precision, a thought began to form in her mind. His cruelty wasn't passionate. It was programmatic. It was the cruelty of a machine, or of someone who had been taught to systematically eliminate all emotion from their decision-making. That was the real story. Not the chess, not the money, but the man. Who was Alistair Vance before he was Alistair Vance? She found the small group from the orphanage huddled in the back. She approached Mrs. Gable, her press pass and a warm, disarming smile at the ready. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. I'm a reporter. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your star player." Mrs. Gable looked wary, her arms protectively drawing the children closer. "Lily isn't a star player. She's just a little girl who likes the game. We're only here because Mr. Henderson from the mayor's office was kind enough to get us tickets." "But she did register to play, didn't she?" Sarah pressed gently. "That was a bit of a misunderstanding," Mrs. Gable sighed. "Sam, one of our older boys, thought it would be funny. He filled out the form online. We didn't know until the organizers called. Lily didn't even want to come. She's very shy. But the other children were so excited for a field trip." Sarah looked over at Lily, who was still transfixed by the game on the stage. The girl was completely oblivious to their conversation. "They say she's good," Sarah said, fishing. Mrs. Gable's expression softened, a hint of pride breaking through her worry. "She is. She's remarkable. Her father taught her. He left behind an old, battered chess set when he left. It's her most prized possession. She plays against herself for hours. She reads any chess book she can get her hands on. We have a few volunteers who come to the orphanage, retired gentlemen. One of them was a university chess coach. He said he's never seen a talent like hers. So intuitive. It's like the board speaks to her." Sarah's journalistic instincts were tingling. "Her father?" Mrs. Gable's face clouded over. "Her mother was one of our girls, years ago. She came back to us when Lily was a baby. She was a wonderful, bright young woman, but she had a hard life. She passed away from pneumonia a few winters back. We don't know who Lily's father is. Her mother never said. All we have is that chess set, and a first name." Sarah leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What was her mother's name?" "Elena," Mrs. Gable said softly. "Her name was Elena." The final exhibition match, before the main event, concluded. Alistair stood once more, the applause washing over him, meaningless and distant. He was bored. The intellectual stimulation he had hoped for was absent. These opponents were predictable, their minds running on well-worn tracks of established theory. There was no artistry, no surprise. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. As he made his way to the private lounge prepared for him, he caught a glimpse of the group from the orphanage. They were being shuffled towards the exit by a security guard, their time in the grand hall clearly over. And for a brief, inexplicable moment, his eyes met Lily's. It was not a long gaze, a fraction of a second. But in that fraction, Alistair felt something shift in the air, a strange jolt, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for decades. It wasn't her poverty or her age. It was her eyes. They were not the eyes of a child starstruck by his fame and wealth. They were analytical. They were appraising him. And in their depths, there was a profound, unnerving stillness, a familiarity that he couldn't place, but that resonated somewhere deep within him, in the place where he kept the wooden pawn and the memories he refused to acknowledge. He shook the feeling off, annoyed at his own momentary lapse. It was nothing, just a trick of the light. He entered his lounge, where Jonathan was waiting with a bottle of sparkling water. "The final selection for the challenge is being made, sir. It will be announced in 5 minutes." Alistair took the water, his hand perfectly steady. But as he looked at his reflection in the polished silver tray, it was not his own face he saw for a split second, but the solemn, knowing eyes of a 10-year-old girl. Back in the hall, Sarah Jenkins was working quickly. The name Elena had sparked something. It was a common name, but context was everything. She had access to city archives and public records through her publications database. Sitting on a marble bench in a quiet corridor, she typed furiously on her laptop. She searched for records connected to St. Jude's orphanage. Adoptions, departures, deaths. She cross-referenced the name Elena with the approximate age Mrs. Gable had implied. The search yielded dozens of results. It was a needle in a haystack. But journalists who are good at their jobs are masters of finding the right needle. She narrowed the search. She looked for any mention of chess, any clubs, any tournaments, any newspaper clippings from 25, 30 years ago, and then she found it. A small digitized article from a local community newspaper, dated 35 years ago. The headline was simple: "Orphanage Chess Club Shines at City Youth Tournament." The article mentioned 2 standout players from St. Jude's, a fiercely competitive boy who swept the top prize, and a quiet, observant girl who took second place, known for her creative and unconventional strategies. The boy's name was listed as Alistair, no last name. The girl's name was Elena. Sarah's heart began to pound. It was a long shot, a wild coincidence. But what if it wasn't? Alistair Vance's official biography was notoriously vague about his early childhood. It stated he was adopted at age 12 by the wealthy Vance family, who recognized his prodigious intellect. But before that, the records were sealed. It was a blank page, a past he had deliberately and thoroughly erased. She looked at the grainy black and white photo accompanying the article. 2 children stood beside a trophy, their faces a mixture of pride and awkwardness. The boy was gaunt, with an intense, hungry look in his eyes that was still recognizable in the billionaire's piercing gaze, and the girl beside him with a shy smile and large, solemn eyes. She looked exactly like Lily. On stage, the chief arbiter tapped the microphone. The hall fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a most exciting evening of chess. Mr. Vance has proven to be an unstoppable force. It is now time to announce his final challenger for the Vance Industries Grand Challenge." He held up an envelope. "The challenger has been selected at random from the pool of registered participants who have not yet played." This was part of the showmanship, a chance for a dramatic surprise. The crowd murmured in anticipation. Alistair stood by the stage, a glass of water in his hand, the picture of calm. He assumed it would be some amateur, an easy final kill to end the night. The arbiter opened the envelope. He blinked, looked at the paper again, and then cleared his throat. The challenger is Lily, from the St. Jude's orphanage. A wave of shock and confusion rippled through the audience. People turned in their seats, whispering. Was this a joke? A publicity stunt gone too far? Jonathan Hayes, standing beside Alistair, went pale. Sir, this is a disaster. My apologies. I will have this rectified immediately. It's a mistake. But Alistair held up a hand, silencing him. His face was a stone mask, but his mind was racing. The girl, the eyes, the strange, unsettling feeling of recognition. He felt the pawn in his pocket, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, tinged with a dangerous, unfamiliar emotion, ignited within him. This was not on the program. This was not in the script. For the first time all night, Alistair Vance did not know what was going to happen next. He looked towards the back of the hall, where a small, terrified-looking girl was being coaxed forward by a woman with a kind face. He smiled, that same cold, predatory smile. "No, Jonathan," he said, his voice a low purr. "Let the child play." This, he thought, would be far more amusing than crushing another predictable grandmaster. The slaughter would be even more spectacular. Lily felt 100 pairs of hands pushing her forward, though only Mrs. Gables was actually on her back. The bright lights of the stage were blinding, the silence of the crowd a physical weight. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had never been the center of attention in her life. She was the girl who hid in the library, the one who sat in the back of the class, the one who preferred the quiet company of 64 squares and 32 pieces to the noisy chaos of the playground. Mrs. Gable knelt down, her face level with Lily's. "You don't have to do this, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "We can just go home." Lily looked past her, at the stage, at the man standing there like a king, his shadow long and dark under the lights. She saw the chessboard waiting. It was the only thing in the entire, terrifying room that made sense. The board was a world of logic, of rules, of cause and effect, a world she understood. She took a deep breath, the stale, air-conditioned air filling her small lungs. "It's okay," she said, her own voice sounding small and foreign to her ears. "It's just a game." She pulled away from Mrs. Gable's comforting hand and began the long, lonely walk to the stage. She climbed the small set of stairs, her worn-out sneakers making no sound on the carpet. She looked tiny on the massive stage, a small boat set adrift in a vast ocean. She reached the table and had to stand on her tiptoes to pull the heavy chair out. She clambered onto it, her feet dangling a foot from the floor. She looked across the board at Alistair Vance. His face was unreadable, a polite, chilling mask. He was studying her the way a scientist studies a curious insect. He saw the frayed collar of her hand-me-down dress, the nervous way she twisted her hands in her lap. He saw fear. Good. The arbiter approached the table. "The challenger, as the player with the black pieces in the last game on this board, will have the white pieces. Lily, you will make the first move. Mr. Vance, are you ready?" Alistair nodded, a slight, condescending inclination of his head. "Lily?" the arbiter asked gently. The little girl gave a small, jerky nod, her eyes fixed on the army of ivory pieces before her. The great hall was so quiet that the ticking of the large tournament clock when the arbiter pressed the button, sounded like a hammer blow. The Vance Industries Grand Challenge had begun. Lily reached out a small, trembling hand. The audience leaned forward as one. What would she do? A standard king's pawn opening? A more conservative queen's pawn? Her fingers hovered over the pieces. Then her hand darted out, and she pushed the pawn in front of her king's knight forward one square. Just one. Knight to f3. It was an unorthodox opening move, passive and strange. It developed a piece, but it didn't fight for the center. It didn't declare any grand intentions. It was a quiet, waiting move. A whisper instead of a shout. In the commentary booth, the grandmasters were baffled. A peculiar choice, one said. The Zuckertor opening, but a very timid variation. It cedes the center to black immediately. Perhaps it's just nerves. Alistair raised an eyebrow. The move was amateurish, childish. He felt a pang of disappointment. This wasn't even going to be a challenge. It would be an execution. He responded by seizing the center, pushing his queen's pawn to d5, a powerful, commanding reply. He now controlled the heart of the board. The game was, for all intents and purposes, already his. Lily's response was just as strange. She moved her g-pawn forward one square, another small, quiet, seemingly pointless move. It prepared to fianchetto her bishop, but it was slow. It was the kind of move a beginner would make, thinking about one small corner of the board while ignoring the larger strategic battle. Alistair's lips tightened into a thin line of annoyance. She wasn't playing, she was fiddling. He continued his classical development, bringing out his knights, controlling space, building an ironclad fortress in the center of the board. And with every powerful textbook move he made, Lily responded with another of her quiet, creeping, sideways maneuvers. She developed her pieces on the flanks, her pawns making a strange, crooked wall on the king side. Her strategy seemed disjointed, aimless. The commentators began to openly mock her. She seems to be creating some sort of hedgehog formation, but without any of the underlying positional understanding. It's a tragic sight, really. She's completely out of her depth. The audience grew restless. This wasn't the grand spectacle they had been promised. This was a farce. But Alistair Vance was no longer smiling. Beneath his placid exterior, a seed of unease was beginning to sprout. Her moves were terrible. Objectively, strategically, they were weak, but they were also connected. He couldn't see the full picture yet, but he could feel it. There was a hidden logic to her seemingly random placements. His powerful center was like a great castle, but her strange, creeping pieces were like vines, slowly, silently growing around its foundations. She wasn't attacking him. She was surrounding him. He paused, his hand hovering over his bishop. He had a dozen good moves. The computer analysis that he could run in his head told him he had an overwhelming advantage. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. The board in front of him was beginning to look wrong. It was a position he had never seen, never studied. It was a position born not from theory, but from pure, unadulterated intuition. Her intuition. And it was deeply, profoundly unsettling. He tried to force the issue, to crack open her formation with a pawn break in the center. He calculated the variations, 10 moves deep. It should have worked. It should have shattered her position and exposed her king. He pushed the pawn. Lily looked at the move for less than a second before making her reply. She didn't take his pawn. She ignored it completely. Instead, she slid her bishop out from its fianchettoed position, placing it on a square where it stared down the long diagonal, a silent sniper aimed at his queenside. The move did nothing to address his central threat, but it created a new one, a subtle, venomous threat that he hadn't considered. And suddenly, his brilliant pawn break looked not like an attack, but like a weakness, a self-inflicted wound. He had opened a line not for his own attack, but for hers. A low murmur went through the crowd. They might not be grandmasters, but they could see that the Titan had paused, that the girl's strange move had given him something to think about. Alistair's mind raced. He reevaluated. The position was still better for him, but the path to victory was no longer clear. It was shrouded in a fog of complications that she and she alone had created. Who was this child? Sarah Jenkins watched from the press gallery, her laptop open, the old news article glowing on her screen. She had been feeding her findings to her editor, who was now scrambling a team to dig deeper into the sealed adoption records of Alistair Vance. But Sarah wasn't watching her screen. She was watching Alistair's face. She saw the microscopic tightening of the muscles around his jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, the way his perfectly still hand now betrayed a faint telltale tension. He was shaken. This little girl, with her quiet, nonsensical moves, had gotten under his skin. The story wasn't just a possibility anymore. Sarah felt a deep conviction growing in her gut. This wasn't just a chess game. It was a reckoning. She looked over at Mrs. Gable, who was watching with her hands clasped to her mouth, her face a mask of hope and terror. She looked at Lily, a small, fragile figure in an oversized chair, her feet not even reaching the floor, who was, at this very moment, dismantling the defenses of one of the most powerful and ruthless men on the planet. And she started to type a new lead for her story. The game deepened. It became a strange, hypnotic dance. Alistair's powerful, classical pieces versus Lily's fluid, guerrilla army. He would attack, and she would sidestep, her pieces flowing like water around his assaults. She never met him head-on. She retreated, she repositioned. She wove intricate defensive webs that were as beautiful as they were frustrating. The commentators in the booth had fallen silent. They no longer understood what they were seeing. The computer evaluations on their screens still showed a slight advantage for Vance, but the numbers were fluctuating wildly with every move. The machine, like the man, was struggling to comprehend this unorthodox, intuitive style. 20 moves, 30 moves. The clock ticked on. The hall was now tomb silent. No one coughed, no one whispered. Every single person was locked in the psychic drama playing out on the 64 squares. Alistair felt a drop of sweat trace a path down his temple. He discreetly wiped it away. He was still winning, technically. He had more space. His pieces were more active. But he felt like he was fighting a ghost. A phantom army that refused to engage in a conventional battle, and then Lily made a move. It was her 40th move, securing more time on the clock. She moved her rook from the A file to the B file, a simple, sideways slide. To the commentators, to the audience, it looked like a simple defensive redeployment. But to Alistair, it was a thunderclap. That move, that specific, peculiar rook lift. It wasn't just a move on the board. It was a memory, a ghost rising from a shallow grave. The penthouse, the boardroom, the billions, they all dissolved. Suddenly, he was 12 years old again. He was skinny and angry, with a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. He was in the dimly lit common room of St. Jude's orphanage, a place that always smelled of boiled cabbage and disinfectant. The floor was scuffed linoleum. The furniture was donated and mismatched. And across a wobbly card table from him sat a girl with a shy smile and large, solemn eyes. Her name was Elena. They were inseparable. Two lonely, forgotten children who had found a universe in a battered old chess set with a mismatched bishop and a pawn with a crooked head. They played every day, for hours. He was the better player, the more aggressive, the one who studied the few tattered books in the library. But Elena, she had a gift. She didn't see the board in terms of openings and endgames. She saw it as a story. She gave the pieces personalities. She invented her own strategies, whimsical and strange. She called them things like the Turtle's Fortress or the Dancing Knights. And one day, sitting at that wobbly table, they invented an opening together, a system of moves that was uniquely theirs. It started with the Quiet Knight move. It involved a slow, creeping development on the flank. It was built around a strange, seemingly illogical rook, lift, on the queen's side. A move that looked passive, but was secretly the coiled spring for a devastating counterattack. A private language spoken in the language of chess. They called it the Sparrow's Gambit, because Elena said the pawns looked like little sparrows hopping from branch to branch. Alistair stared at the board, but he was seeing that dusty common room. He could smell the cabbage. He could feel the cheap, plastic texture of the mismatched bishop. He could hear Elena's quiet giggle when her strange strategy would, against all odds, trap one of his powerful pieces. They had made a promise, huddled together in the dark of the dormitory one night, after he had been told the Vance family wanted to meet him. A rich, childless couple. It was his ticket out, his escape. "You'll write," Elena had whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Of course I will," he had promised, his own voice sounding braver than he felt. "And I'll come back for you. We'll have a house, a real one, with a proper chess set, made of marble." He had believed it, for a while. But the world of the Vances was a whirlpool that sucked him in. Tutors, private schools, lessons in etiquette and business. They scrubbed St. Jude's from him. They taught him that looking back was a weakness. They gave him a new name, a new history, a new life. And he, in his hunger for success, for power, for a life that was the opposite of the one he'd had let them. The letters he wrote were never sent. The promise he made was buried, along with the boy named Alistair, who had made it. The boy who loved a girl named Elena, and played a game called the Sparrow's Gambit. His breathing grew ragged. The sounds of the hall faded to a dull roar. He looked across the board, past the pieces, and truly saw the girl for the first time. He saw the shape of her eyes, the gentle curve of her chin, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw Elena. It was her face, her eyes, staring back at him across a gulf of 35 years. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random child. This was Elena's daughter. And she was playing their game, their secret. A message sent from the grave, delivered by the most innocent of messengers. Every move she had made. The quiet night opening. The slow, creeping flank development. The strange, crooked pawn wall. It was the Sparrow's Gambit, played perfectly, from memory. A game she could not possibly know. Unless her mother had taught her, had spent her last years teaching her daughter the one precious, secret thing she owned. A memory of a boy who made a promise. a silent, desperate message in a bottle, tossed into the ocean of time that had somehow, impossibly, washed ashore here, tonight, under the glare of 1,000 lights. The weight of it all hit him, the abandoned promise, the forgotten friendship, the life he had turned his back on, the woman he had left behind, who had clearly lived and died in the same poverty he had so desperately escaped. And this child, her child, his... The thought was a bolt of lightning that seared his soul. He looked at Lily, at her threadbare dress and her solemn, knowing eyes, and he understood that his entire life, his empire of wealth and power, was built on a foundation of betrayal. It was a monument to a broken promise. The crowd was stirring, whispering. He had been staring at the board for 10 minutes. His clock was ticking down. Jonathan Hayes was at the side of the stage, his face tight with anxiety, making frantic hand signals. Alistair saw none of it. He looked at the position. He saw the move he was supposed to make. The winning move. The logical, crushing, final blow that would end the game and secure his victory. And he saw another move. A move from a different game, a different lifetime. The response. The counter move to the rook lift in the Sparrow's Gambit. It was a terrible move. In this context, it would lose him a piece. It would cost him the game. But it was the right move. It was the only move. It was his half of the conversation. He reached out his hand, no longer steady, and picked up his knight. The audience gasped. He was moving the wrong piece. He was walking into a trap. He placed the knight on the square. The move that said, "I remember." He looked up at Lily. Her eyes widened, and for the first time that night, a small, sad, knowing smile touched her lips. She understood. He had answered her. Then, to the utter bewilderment of everyone in the grand library, Alistair Vance stood up. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the stunned silence. He walked around the table until he was standing beside the small girl in the oversized chair. He looked down at her, and the cold, arrogant mask he had worn for 35 years crumbled into dust. The face beneath it was one of profound, bottomless grief. "Elena," he whispered, his voice cracking, just her name, a question and a prayer. Lily looked up at him, her large, solemn eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She simply nodded. It was all the confirmation he needed. The world tilted on its axis. He looked out at the sea of shocked, confused faces. The cameras, the lights, the politicians, the rivals. They were all meaningless. The only thing that mattered was this small girl, this ghost from his past, this living embodiment of his greatest failure and his deepest regret. He turned to the arbiter. "I forfeit," he said, his voice choked but clear. A collective audible gasp swept through the hall. Forfeit? Alistair Vance, the man who lived and breathed for victory? He didn't wait for a response. He knelt down in front of Lily, ignoring the explosion of flashing cameras, the chaos that was erupting around them. He was no longer the billionaire titan. He was just Alistair, the boy from St. Jude's. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words torn from a place deep inside him that he thought had died long ago. "I am so sorry." Tears, hot and unfamiliar, streamed down his face. He reached into his waistcoat pocket, and his trembling fingers closed around the small, crooked wooden pawn. He pulled it out and gently placed it in her small, open hand. Lily closed her fingers around it, the wood warm from his body. She looked at the pawn, then back at him, and her own tears began to fall, silent tracks of grief and understanding on her dusty cheeks. The game was over. But something far more important had just begun. The aftermath was a media hurricane. Headlines screamed from every newspaper and news site on the planet. Vance crumbles! Billionaire's mysterious meltdown. Orphan girl defeats tycoon. Speculation was rampant. Was he ill? Was it a nervous breakdown? Was the entire thing an elaborately staged publicity stunt? No one knew the truth, because Alistair Vance had vanished. He had been whisked away from the library by a frantic Jonathan Hayes, shielding him from the ravenous press. He didn't go back to his penthouse. He didn't go to his office. He had Jonathan drive him, in complete silence, to the one place in the city he had spent a lifetime avoiding. St. Jude's Orphanage stood on a forgotten street in a neighborhood that time had passed by. The brick was crumbling, the paint on the window frames was peeling, and the small patch of grass out front was more weeds than lawn. It looked exactly as he remembered it. He asked Jonathan to wait in the car and walked to the front door, each step heavier than the last. He rang the bell, his heart pounding a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. The door was opened by Mrs. Gable. Her eyes widened in shock and then narrowed with a fierce, protective suspicion. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice cold, "what do you want?" "I need to speak with you," he said, his own voice hoarse. "About Lily, about her mother." He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. She hesitated, then wordlessly opened the door and led him into a small, cluttered office that smelled of tea and old books. He sat on a worn armchair, the springs groaning in protest. He felt like a giant in the tiny room, his expensive suit and polished shoes a sacrilege in this place of humble survival. Mrs. Gable sat behind her desk, her hands folded, waiting. "Tell me about Elena," he said, the name feeling strange and holy on his tongue. And so she did. Mrs. Gable told him the story of Elena's life after he had left, how she had waited for letters that never came, how she had eventually aged out of the system, a bright, gentle girl, thrown into a world that had no place for her. She had worked a series of dead-end jobs, always struggling, but never losing the quiet kindness that was her nature. She had fallen in love, for a short time, with a man who had left her as soon as he found out she was pregnant. She had returned to St. Jude's, not as a resident, but as a volunteer, and eventually, when she got too sick to work, as a charity case, seeking shelter for herself and her daughter. "She talked about you sometimes," Mrs. Gable said, her voice soft but laced with an unspoken accusation. "She told Lily stories about a boy she used to know, a boy who was a king on the chessboard. She taught Lily how to play, using that old set you two had. She called it your game. It was all she had left of you, a memory, and she gave it to her daughter." Alistair listened, each word a physical blow. He saw the life he could have had, the life Elena should have had, the marble chess set, the house, the promises he had whispered in the dark. "She passed away 3 years ago," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice thick with emotion. "The pneumonia came on fast. We couldn't afford the best doctors. The public clinic was overwhelmed. It was a hard winter." She paused, and then delivered the final, devastating blow. "We were struggling more than usual that year. The city cut our funding. The old textile factory down the road, the one that used to donate to us every Christmas, had been shut down a few months earlier. It had been bought out and liquidated by some big, faceless corporation. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. The whole neighborhood went under." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. The corporation was Vance Industries. The air left Alistair's lungs. It was a physical punch to the gut. Not only had he abandoned her, not only had he broken his promise, but the soulless, profit-driven machine he had built, the very symbol of his success, had been the instrument of her final, desperate hardship. He had, in his quest to conquer the world, inadvertently destroyed the one person he had ever truly cared about. He broke down. Not the silent, dignified tears of the library, but a raw, ugly, gut-wrenching sob that tore its way out of his chest. He buried his face in his hands, the sound of his own grief echoing in the small, quiet office, a sound 35 years overdue. He spent the next few days in a self-imposed exile, holed up in a hotel under a false name. He didn't speak to Jonathan. He didn't look at the news. He just paced the room, a prisoner of his own memories. The ghost of Elena was everywhere. In his mind, he played their last game of chess over and over. He reread the promise in her eyes. He felt the crushing weight of his failure. He was a man who could predict markets, who could dismantle corporations, who could see 10 moves ahead on a chessboard. But he had been utterly blind to the one move that had mattered, the move of keeping his word. Slowly, painstakingly, a new resolve began to form amidst the wreckage of his guilt. The grief was not going away. He knew it would be a part of him forever, but he couldn't let it consume him. He had a new promise to keep, one to the memory of Elena and to the future of her daughter. He finally called Jonathan, his voice calm and clear for the first time in days. His instructions were precise. He was liquidating assets. He was restructuring his company. He was setting up a foundation, a massive one. He returned to St. Jude's a week later, not as a billionaire, but as a penitent. He found Lily sitting alone on a squeaky swing in the small, cracked asphalt playground. She was holding the wooden pawn. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wary. He didn't offer any grand speeches or apologies. He just sat on the swing next to her. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the rhythmic squeaking of the rusty chains. "Your mother," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "She was the smartest person I ever knew, and the kindest." Lily clutched the pawn tighter. "She said you were a king," she said, her voice a small whisper, "but that you got lost trying to find your castle." Alistair closed his eyes. "I did," he said. "I got lost. I built the biggest, emptiest castle in the world." He opened his eyes and looked at her. She was a much better player than I was. Her moves, they had a heart. Mine were just numbers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet bag. He poured the contents into his hand. They were the rest of the pieces from the old handmade chess set. The mismatched bishop, the chipped knights. He had kept them all. He had hidden them away in a safe deposit box, another piece of his past he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring himself to throw away. He held them out to her. Lily looked at the pieces, then at him. Her lower lip trembled. She emptied her own pocket, placing the crooked pawn with the others in his outstretched hand, completing the set. It was an act of forgiveness, an acceptance, a silent understanding that their shared history, their shared loss, now bound them together. The announcement, when it came, sent an even bigger shock wave through the world than his forfeit had. Alistair Vance was stepping down as CEO of Vance Industries. He was placing the bulk of his personal fortune into a new charitable organization, the Elena Foundation. Its mission was to provide funding and support for underprivileged children, with a focus on education, housing, and health care. St. Jude's Orphanage would be its first beneficiary, receiving a grant that would not only save it, but allow it to build a new, state-of-the-art facility. Mrs. Gable was named to the Foundation's board of directors. The press, which had been painting him as a mentally unstable villain, was left speechless. Sarah Jenkins wrote the definitive story, piecing together the threads of his past, not as an exposé, but as a tragic, human story of loss and perhaps redemption. She didn't have to dig for the adoption records. Alastair unsealed them himself. He wanted the world to know who he was and where he came from. He wanted to reclaim the boy he had abandoned. The world of finance wrote him off as a fool. His rivals moved in to carve up his empire. He didn't care. He had spent his life winning a game that didn't matter, and in the process had lost everything. Now he was finally playing for the right stakes. Years passed. The new St. Jude's was a bright, beautiful place, filled with laughter and hope. The Elena Foundation had changed the lives of thousands of children across the country. Alastair Vance was no longer a fixture on the business channels, but he was a familiar sight in the park across from the new orphanage. He was older now, the iron in his posture replaced by a gentle stoop. The coldness in his eyes had thawed, replaced by a quiet, weary warmth. He was teaching children how to play chess, not the brutal, aggressive style he had once mastered, but a gentler, more creative game. A game with heart. Lily was now a teenager, bright and kind, with her mother's solemn eyes and her own quiet confidence. She was at the top of her class, a brilliant student with a scholarship to any university she chose. Alastair had not formally adopted her. They had both decided against it. Their bond was something different, something deeper. He was not her father, but he was her family, her link to a past she had never known, and her guardian for the future. They often sat in the park, at a stone chess table, playing with a beautiful new marble set. But more often than not, they would bring out the old, battered wooden one. One sunny afternoon, they sat across from each other, the gentle murmur of the city around them. Lily picked up a white pawn. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that held the ghost of her mother's. She pushed the pawn in front of her king's knight, forward one square. The opening move of the sparrow's gambit. Alastair looked at the board, then at the wonderful young woman sitting across from him. He felt the familiar ache of grief for the friend he had lost, but it was now intertwined with a profound sense of peace and gratitude. He had lost the game, forfeited his crown, and given away his castle. And in doing so, he had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found his way home. He reached out and made his own first move, his answer in their silent, beautiful language. The game began anew,